In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the concept of average atomic mass. When we look at the atomic mass of an element in the periodic table, what we notice is it is not a whole number, even though that mass number is determined by the number of protons and neutrons, which are whole numbers. So for example, carbon has a mass of 12.011. This results because there are actually multiple isotopes of carbon that exist in nature, and we can label these as carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. And that tells us something about the number of neutrons, because we know that the number of protons in carbon must be 6. So if the mass is different, it's due to a different number of neutrons. So we can actually think of this weighted average similar to how your course grades are calculated. For example, your exams are 75% of your grade, homework is 10%. All of these percentages add up to 100%. And we see the same thing happening when we look at isotopes. And what we see is that in this case, carbon 12 is the most prevalent isotope present, and we notice that the atomic mass is closest to 12. But we know there's some other isotopes present that actually bring the average up slightly above 12. But I can look at this number and see what it's closest to determine what the most common isotope is. Now we're not going to go through the quantitative calculations associated with finding this 12.011, but I want to show you the data that goes into it so you have a better understanding of where that average comes from. So when I look at carbon 12, so we have a mass number of 12, I see that its atomic mass is 12.000, and it has a natural abundance of 98.89%. What that tells me is if I have a sample of carbon atoms and I were able to separate out these isotopes, that the pile that would be the biggest would be the carbon 12, that 98.89% of those atoms would be carbon 12 atoms. I would then see that carbon 13 has 1.11%, so a much smaller percentage. So it contributes slightly to this mass being above 12, but notice that it's very small amounts above the value of 12, which is our most common isotope. And then carbon 14, there are trace amounts. And what that tells me is that the percentage of carbon 14 actually falls smaller than the decimal places I have in these two values. But there is a very small amount of it that does contribute to this mass. So here we see carbon 12, the most common isotope, almost 99%, and we see that the average atomic mass on the periodic table is closest to 12. So we can determine the most common isotope, the information given in the periodic table.